Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Indian knowledge system actively works for spreading the rich heritage of our country and traditional knowledge in the field of arts and literature, agriculture, basic sciences, engineering and technology, architecture, management, economics, etc. In this video, Professor Ganti Murthy will give you a thorough knowledge on how Indian knowledge system is integrating into the fabric of our education research ecosystem for the contemporary world.
Today, we would like to talk to you about the Indian knowledge systems. What exactly is it, and what is the work that the Indian Knowledge Systems Division of the Ministry of Education is doing in this area? And one of the questions that comes up whenever we talk about IKS or Indian knowledge systems is what is this IKS? And if we are talking about Indian knowledge systems, is it relevant today? How is it different from any other regular teaching and research that we do? How should we do it if it is different? These are all the questions that we all get in our minds. And then one of the biggest questions that youth gets today is it necessary to study what our ancestors did thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago? How will it help me solve the challenges of 21st century? These are all the questions that arise in the mind. And as the civilization that always encouraged questioning and encouraged debate, we need to be addressing these questions up front and center. And I will start off with what Mahakavi Kalidasa said in Malavikagnimitram. He says, Puranamityeva nasadhu sarvam, nachapi kavyam navamityavadyam, santah parikshant yatarad bhajante, mudah parapratyayane buddhi. What he is saying is, remember, Kalidasa was there about 2000 years ago. And what he says in this Malavikagnimitram is, Puranamityeva nasadu sarvam. Just because something is old, it does not become gold. Nachapi kavyam navamityavadyam. Kalidasa, as you know, was a great poet. So he was talking about it in the context of the poetry. He says, Nachapi kavyam navamityavadyam. So just because a poetry is new, we should not discard it. Santah parikshant yatarad bhajante. The wise will examine the different things based on their merits and then decide. Whereas Mudaha, the fools, will be led by the opinions of others. Parapratyayane buddhi. It is with that kind of a attitude that we will look at the Indian knowledge systems today. And when you look at the world today, there are so many crises. Whether we talk about environmental challenges, whether we are talking about economic challenges, whether we are talking about challenges with the healthcare systems across the world, the lack of ethics, morals, and all of these issues that we are facing today, is becoming self-evident that the current models of development that we have talked about, which are based on exploitation of nature, are really unsustainable and really are in conflict with the nature, and there are rising inequalities. And when we sit back and think about it, what is the response of India? Is this the way that we used to think about it? Then it becomes very clear that there is an Indian way that is both sustainable and strives for the welfare of all. As the Indian Knowledge Systems Division's Dheya Vakya is, Bhadrayam Sumatau Yatema. That means let us strive for a wisdom that works for the welfare of all. Again, this is essentially the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam kind of a thought process that brought us, that brings it. There is an Indian way. And if we want to really become the knowledge power in 21st century, Vishwaguru, then there is an important thing that we need to teach the world and demonstrate it to the world. What is this Indian way of doing things? And when we really think about Indian way of doing things, and especially in the context of the Indian knowledge systems, there is really a paucity of genuine scholarship in this area. Why? Because of our unfortunate legacy of colonial education in this country. We have very few scholars who are actually genuine scholars in these areas. So there is really a need for investing in IKS and then taking this further and nurturing genuine scholarship, because what that has led to is a lot of myths and unscientific claims. For example, there are claims on both sides. Some people will say Indian science is a myth. Indians did not know anything. Indians learned math basically from the West Indians learnt everything from the West. Whereas there will be other people who will say, we have everything in our culture, we have everything in our mentioned in our Vedas, and string theory is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita and things like that. These are all extreme claims which actually damage the genuine IKS traditions that we had in this country. And therefore, there is a critical need for the higher educational institutions to take the leadership positions in doing research, researching the scientific, technological heritage. And then, fortunately for us, the NEP 2020, the National Education Policy of 2020, places a great emphasis on learning basically the Indian knowledge systems, rootedness in India as it calls it, and it talks about multidisciplinary and multilinguistic learning. And this is essentially what the IKS emphasizes as well. And if you look at NEP, the national policy, education policy, it says in the very beginning itself that the rich heritage of ancient and eternal Indian knowledge and thought has been the guiding light for this policy. And it talks about IKS, Indian knowledge systems, in many, many places in the curricular integration, and talks about when it talks about towards a more holistic and multidisciplinary education, catalyzing the quality academic research, when it talks about the professional education, when it talks about the promotion of Indian languages, arts and culture, all of these things, it really emphasizes on Indian knowledge systems in a very, very big way. So then the question becomes, what is this Indian knowledge systems that we are talking about? What is this Indian knowledge systems? So when we think about that, essentially Indian knowledge system comprises of the Jnana, Vijnana and the Jivana Darshana of the people of Bharat, which has continuously arisen in this land out of the deep experience, observation and experimentation with rigorous analysis, with a tradition of validating and putting it into practice in several areas, whether you talk about it as commerce, mathematics, engineering, art, law, justice, administration, culture, all of these things, it has been put into practice. It's expressed through the culture of the Bharat and has been transmitted through the classical languages of Bharat and transmitted through text, oral and artistic and folk traditions of India. So that essentially is the whole encompassing thing about the Indian knowledge systems. And then when you think about this, the Jivana Darshana, which arises from the deep experience, is directly related to the drishti or the perspective of how we look at the world. And that essentially is what informs. The Jivana Darshana informs the drishti of any civilization. And we have a very unique drishti that makes this knowledge system Indian, because this makes this Jnana Parampara Bharatiya because of this Jivana Darshana or the drishti. And then from that Jivana Darshana is essentially arises the Jnana, the knowledge which is transmitted through textual, oral, artistic traditions and is documented in all the languages of Bharat. And that leads to the parampara, because there is a knowledge of continuous transmission of knowledge. That is the Jnana Parampara that is there. We also call it as Jnana Dhara, Jnana Ganga, again referring to that continuous flow of knowledge. And then that leads to Vijnana, that means practical application. It is practiced in various fields of human endeavor, and that essentially leads to Laukika Prayojana. So when you think about it, the Jivana Darshana translates into the drishti, the perspective in the real world, and the Jnana is essentially accomplished through the paramparas, the knowledge transmission traditions, and then the Vijnana is the Laukika Prayojana that we have. And then when you think about these parampara, the knowledge tradition, then when you think about it, it actually consists of three parts. The first thing we normally talk about whenever we talk about the maintaining the flow of knowledge, Jnana Dhara, Parampara, Jnan Ki Ganga, jo kehte hain, all of these things are firstly about preservation, of course, because we want to preserve our manuscripts, we want to preserve our culture, all of that thing is fine, well, it's good. But more important, more fundamental is that we need to preserve the drishti, the perspective, because that is completely associated with the Jivana Darshana. What makes this knowledge system Bharatiya or Indian? That essentially is that drishti. And so it's important whenever we are talking about preservation, we need to be preserving our manuscripts, we need to be preserving our textual traditions, we need to be preserving our oral traditions, culture, all of those things. But along with that, we should be placing a lot of emphasis on preserving the IKS drishti. And then when we think about preservation, that is one aspect of parampara, because we have to preserve what is there. But second thing is we have to transmit it from one generation to the other generation. And when we try to do that, we need to evolve methods of how we transmit. For example, 30 years ago, we used writing on blackboards was very common in many of the institutions. Now we are talking about it on a mobile phone or in a digital media, like on a computer or in a screen like this. So the transmission methods have changed. They have evolved according to time. So we need to adapt our methods of transmission or teaching to our younger generation as per the needs of the society. And then no knowledge parampara is complete just with preservation and transmission. It has to be a living tradition. A knowledge tradition will be called a living tradition or a jnana parampara. Again, jnana ganga, only when there is a creation of knowledge. It is not just about preservation and transmission, but it is also about the creation of knowledge. And when you think about the creation of the knowledge, this process has been continuous. When you look at our parampara, the knowledge traditions have been continuously reinvigorated by many thinkers who have come from many times across the country. And therefore, when we talk about Bharatiya Jnana Parampara or the Indian knowledge systems, it is not about history studies. Again, it is not limited to Vedas, Upanishads, Puranas, Bhagavad Gita, or as people call it, as simply Hindu studies. This is much more than all of these things. Why is it? Because we are talking about the Jivana Darshan, the perspective of what makes us Bharatiyas, what makes us as Indians. Therefore, when we talk about Jnana Parampara, we are talking about the preservation, transmission, and the creation of the knowledge. And then again, coming back to that drishti that I was trying to talk about a little bit. So what makes the Bharatiya Jnana Parampara, the drishti, Bharatiya, when you think about it, every civilization has their own way of looking at the world. And for us, we had our own way of looking at the world, and that is informed by looking at the world reality. Of course, when we talk about looking at the world, it looks at how did human beings look at their relationship with the environment and in the universe. And therefore, whenever we look at a phenomena, we look at it typically at three levels. We look at it at a very physical level. It is called adhibhautika per plane. And then we also look at it at a daivika, adhidaivika, or mental or thought level process. And then finally at a spiritual plane, adhyatmika level. So in Bharatiya perspective, there is no separation between sacred and profane. Everything is sacred for us. That is why, in fact, the Ishavasya Upanishad begins, Ishavasya Midagam Sarvam Yatkincha Jagatyam Jagat. And that also informs us the next four goals of the life. It talks about dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. In fact, if you look at the four Purusharthas are the things that we all aspire for. And there is nothing in this world apart from these four that we aspire for. Artha, you all know, acquisition of wealth and all the things. And then kama, enjoying them. But then that has to be within the framework of dharma, sustainability and the duty and all of those things, all the connotations of the word dharma there. And then finally, the spiritual growth is the paradharma, that is the moksha. So if you look at the four Purusharthas, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, these are the things to be achieved. And looking at reality in three levels. And then, of course, there are four stages of life, the four ashramas. We talk about brahmacharya, where we are a student, where we are acquiring knowledge and preparing for the life of grihastha, where it is the only ashrama, if you look at it, all four, which actually supports all the other three. We have our own families, we raise the families, and then support the society and basically become the building block of the society in the grihastha ashrama. And then once the responsibilities are completed, we kind of essentially go to a retired kind of a life, that is the vanaprastha, and then finally to the sannyasa, pursuing the fourth purushartha. These are the essentially four ashramas. So this kind of a perspective of looking at reality in three levels, adhibhautika, adhidaivika, and adhyatmika, and then pursuing the four goals of life, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, and then during the four stages of life, brahmacharya, grihastha, vanaprastha, sannyasa, is a very Bharatiya drishti of how do we look at life itself. And this is something that is very unique to India, if you look at it. And then there are similar drishti konas, drishti perspectives, when you look at various aspects of Bharatiya Jivana Darshana. And IKS provides a unique perspective that is holistic, rigorous, innovative, and it has a hoary tradition of rigorous inquiry. And many innovative approaches are possible. So I would like to provide you some examples of what I'm meaning by uniqueness of Bharatiya Drishti. What makes it Bharatiya Drishti unique? And what is multidisciplinary about it? What is holistic about it? What is this rigorous tradition that I'm talking about? Or things like that. So let's say the Bharatiya Drishti, when you think about it, that can have profound implications in practical life. For example, let's say what is the most dominant economic system today? At a macroeconomic level, it is a capitalism. And what does capitalism talk about? It talks about Shuddha Labh. That means maximizing the profit. That is essentially the pursuit of any capitalistic market. And what does that unbridled capitalism lead to? It will lead to only profit maximization, because that is essentially the goal of the system. And then what will that lead to as a consequence is the exploitation of the nature and the human beings. And essentially will result in pseudo-democracies. We are seeing this all across the world, where democracies, some of the democracies are being controlled by few corporations and they are led by those things. Fortunately for us, we are not one of them, because we have a unique perspective in our country. And then what was the response of the society to that? Essentially, it was the Shunya Labh. So from one end of the spectrum, where it led to Shuddha Labh, the capitalism, rose the communism, which was essentially talking about the Shunya Labh, or basically negation of the profit motive itself. But then unbridled communism will also lead to stifling of the innovation and entrepreneurship. And again, it will lead to exploitation of nature and humans. Ultimately, dictatorships. We have seen that in USSR, we have seen that in China, we are seeing that in North Korea. I mean, we have seen in many, many places where, again, communism failed completely. Capitalism is not a perfect system, and it is failing. We are seeing that too. What was a Bharatiya perspective that these are all, if you look at communism, it actually rose in industrial England when unbridled capitalism was exploiting basically the workers. Therefore, it rose as a response to the unbridled capitalism, the communism. But then what was the Bharatiya perspective in all of this? Did we believe in Shuddha Labh or Shunya Labh? No, we believed in Shubha Labh. That means pursuit of profit, but with a concept of Shubha. That means welfare for all. That means if I'm selling you something, of course I'm working for a profit for myself, but I will not sell you something that will be harmful to you. I will only sell something that will be beneficial for you. Not just for you, but the people whom I have purchased it from. So all of these things are as a consequences of the concept of Shubha Labh. In fact, you will see Shubha Labh written in all our homes, especially during Diwali and all the major festivals. We write Shubha Labh. Any business begins with Shubha Labh. And that essentially is the Bharatiya thinking. And imagine if the world adopted this Shubha Labh concept of Bharat, we will have a world that is harmonious, with less strife, and works for the welfare of all without exploitation of nature. Because the dharma inherent in this Shubha Labh concept acts as a natural break to over-exploitation and things like that. And it's not only at a macroeconomic level, even at a personal level, at a human level, at an individual level. If you think about it, what is the goal of basically the modern economic theory? If I have to pursue that from a individual perspective, it will be the pursuit of consumption. I want to consume more, because that is looked up as a indirect measure of happiness. So consumption of more goods, consumption of basically bigger houses, bigger cars, bigger salaries. That's essentially what the pursuit of consumption will lead to. Again, what will that lead to? Mathematical certainty that it will lead to exploitation of the nature, unlimited growth, which is not possible in a limited world, and societal discord, because there will always be winners and losers when there is excessive competition. Spardhaya vardhate vidya is something that is encouraged. In fact, it is good to have some competition, but excess of anything is not a good thing. And when excessive competition happens, the resources will get divided unequally, and then there will be all kinds of discord in the society. Then what did the Bharatiyas talk about? We talked about pursuit of ananda, happiness. And when you have that kind of a thing, we talk about thriving with nature, not against nature. So there is no exploitation of nature. We want to be happy. Therefore, we will pursue some things. Of course, we'll pursue things, but not to the extent of exploitation. We will thrive with the nature. And then we'll talk about growth, we'll meet growth, but that meets the needs of all, and actually results in societal harmony, because we are talking about the welfare of all. This is what the pursuit of ananda or happiness will do for us. And there, you see, even at the economic level, the kind of just the drishti difference, the perspective difference, the jivan darshana, will result in so much of profound practical differences in the consequences. And how did we get all of this jivan darshana? Because of our rishi parampara that we had. And the great rishis gave us that Jivan Darshana. Again, arising from the experience of Bharatiyas from several millennia, that is how we have formulated that vision. And even in healthcare, if you think about it, even as late as 2005, WHO used to define health as absence of disease. And it was looked at only at something as an absence of disease, and it was disease centric. And it was focused only on treatment of diseases. Therefore, then what becomes is that healthcare becomes the responsibility of an individual, because now the disease is mine, so it is my responsibility to clear that up. Again, if you think through this, it will result in expensive healthcare, expensive insurance. Whereas the Bharatiya concept of swasthya, pursuit of swasthya, in fact, Ayurveda begins with saying swasthasya swasthya rakshanam. So it talks about the preserving the health of the healthy first. Then it talks about aturasya roga shamana. And when you have such a system, it really becomes basically health becomes something that is not just your responsibility. It is also you are responsible for the society, and society is responsible for you. And again, it will lead to affordable healthcare, societal harmony, and things like that. In fact, I remember a practice in some of the villages in Kerala, apparently, where a Vaidya or a village doctor is paid only if everybody in the family is healthy. If anybody is sick, the Vaidya does not get paid. And imagine the kind of consequences that it will have on the Vaidya's attitude to preserving the health of the healthy, swasthasya swasthya rakshanam, and then immediately trying to cure anybody who has the roga, aturasya roga shamana. In fact, this kind of a thinking permeates the practice of Ayurveda that we have, which is based on a systemic approach, which is based on the Tridosha concept, again, looking at the world as something that is made of Pancha Mahabhutas, the Prithvi, Apas, Tejo, Vayu, and Akasha. And these five tattvas make the Tridoshas, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, and from then you look at it from a systemic perspective. Whereas allopathy or modern medicine looks at it from a very reductionist perspective. That means you look at a body as a collection of organs, then each organ systems, then it has organs, then they have cells, molecules, and so on and so forth. And we take a reductionist approach. And if you think about it, this has a lot of benefits. Similarly, Ayurveda's systemic approach has tremendous benefits, especially when you want to make sure that the systemic health is preserved. And therefore, both of these things are required. So please note that when we say that Bharatiya Drishti is different, we are not arguing that Bharatiya Drishti is always superior. We are not that kind of a people. We are a country that said, Ano Atra Kratavo Yattu Vishwata. That means let the noble thoughts come from everywhere. We are not negating the tremendous progress that has been made in the medicine, technologies, science in the last 4 centuries. We want to take that and then take it along with the Bharatiya Chintan that we are talking about. And therefore, I hope with these examples, I was able to give you what makes the Bharatiya Drishti unique. You saw that in the examples of Ayurveda, the health, and in economics. And let me give you a few examples about the multidisciplinarity. If you think about Bharat, for many, many millennia, in fact, Angus Madison's report and things like that, there you will see that we were at least contributing 25% of the world GDP for a long, long time, over 1.5 millennia. And how did we do that? Because we had a lot of agricultural surplus, and the trade, we traded extensively. We traded across the oceans. We went even as far as Zanzibar in Africa, directly from our coasts in Kerala and Gujarat, on the west coast. We went as far as to China from our east coast. And we were tremendous seafarers. And what do all of these things require? We require good knowledge of water cycles, weather cycle, and agriculture. And if you look at agriculture in India, there is confirmed evidence, archaeological evidence, of agriculture at least up to 10,000 years before present. And we had recognition of the water cycle even in Yajurveda times. Shatapada Brahmana talks about Agnirve Dhumo Jayate, which means Agni, fire, creates vapors, heat creates vapors. Dhumat Abramaha, that vapor becomes Abramaha, the clouds. Abrat Vrushti, the clouds give the rain. And this is essentially the basics of the water cycle. And there are many other references even in the Vedic times, and because it was based on direct observations. And rainfall interestingly was considered as Purva Chitti, or something that can be predicted. Prior knowledge, we can have prior knowledge of it. In fact, we have a great number of rishis like Kashyapa, Parashara, Gautama, and Vatsa, who have given many methods for rainfall predictions. In fact, they have talked not only about short term but also long term weather forecasts. There is a text called Krishi Parashara which discusses how you can predict rainfall 6 to 7 months ahead of the time. And then short term, less than 1 week predictions are also there. In fact, Parashara talks about 4 types of clouds: Avarta, Samavarta, Pushkara, and Drona, which are 4 types of clouds, which even, the knowledge was so common that you'll see even in Kalidasa, in his Kavyas, Meghadutam and all, he talks about these different types of the clouds. Varahamihira, of course, in his Brihat Samhita, which was an encyclopedia of India about 1500 years ago, talks about this Garbhottama. Garbhottama is essentially like the seeding of the clouds, and this, he was able to talk about how rainfall will happen 195 days later. And all of this was based on observation, keen observations, analysis, comparing notes, developing models, and then improving them over many cycles. And we'll see all that kind of evolution happening in our texts. Even in modern weather forecasting, we talk about nowcasting, which is essentially for next few hours, short range forecast for 1 to 3 days, medium and long range forecasts. All of these things are very similar to what we had in our things. And in fact, the weather prediction was so important, because if you can predict weather in our Indian subcontinent, then you will be able to predict when you will have water, when you can sow the crops, and when you can actually sow the crops properly, then you will have proper agriculture and with proper yields, and therefore you will also have surplus agriculture in the produce. Even the modern weather forecasting talks about nowcasting, which is essentially for few hours, short range, medium range, and long range forecasts, and very basically something very similar to what we had earlier too. And if you think about it, all of this weather forecasting, when will the rainfall happen, is a very important thing for our agriculture and also for our seafarers, because if they know when the winds blow in one direction or the other direction, they will be able to sail very easily. In fact, the entire Bali Yatra in Cuttack is essentially about when do you start going to Indonesia. How did they go? They started from Cuttack on Kartika Purnima, they went all the way to Sri Lanka, and from there they sailed all the way to Indonesia along the equator. So you think about those journeys that they used to make, and that is essentially that celebration that we celebrate even today as Bali Yatra. Now coming back to agriculture, if you have ability to predict when the rains happen, then you will be able to prepare the land and sow the seeds properly. And if you can do that, then you will have proper crop which will produce a surplus. And if you have surplus, that will mean that you have the ability to feed many more people than who have actually worked on the agriculture field. And when you have the ability to feed many people, that will free them from doing other things like trade or developing new skills and all of those things. So this ability was the key to the foundational basically prosperity of our nation, the ability to predict the weather and rainfall and basically the winds. Therefore, you see the kind of intense work that had gone into developing of an accurate observational astronomy based panchanga, which would actually be used for all of this. In fact, Tyagaraja Swami in one of the kritis says, in Ramarajya, the ideal Ramarajya, there would be 3 rains in a month, and 3 rains in a month would make sure that you don't need any other irrigation. So these are the kind of things that we had observationally. And in fact, it's not just that. When we talk about agriculture, there is also this very famous quote, right? Ahimsa paramo dharma, that occurs in Mahabharata's Anushasana Parva. It occurs in the context of ethical treatment of animals. In fact, it occurs in the context of making sure that we protect animals and don't do any harm to them. Ahimsa paramo dharma, tadha himso paro dhamah, ahimsa paramam dhanam, ahimsa paramam tapah. It says ahimsa, the non-violence towards animals, is the best dharma. And in fact, even Krishi Parashara, because it was all based on our bulls and buffaloes, he says, Vahapidarjitam sasyam phalitam ja chaturganam vahani shvasavatena Jitum cha vinashyati. What he says is, Parashara Maharshi is saying is that if we grow crops by mistreating animals, even if we get a lot of yield, all of that will be gone, because animals being mistreated will cause misfortune to the farmer himself. In fact, Kautilya also in his Arthashastra talks about very strict measures to protect animals, and not just domestic animals but also the wild animals, and very strict punishments were given. And then in fact, this hunting of the wild animals for the sake of entertainment was something that was very strictly forbidden in India. In fact, you hear of the Puranic stories where they used to go to hunt. They were allowed to go to hunt during specific times of the year which were not the breeding times of the year, and they were also allowed to go and hunt only those wild animals if they were causing a menace to the villagers and they were attacking the villagers. Otherwise, they were not allowed to go and kill the animals. In fact, even today in Bengal, Odisha and all, we have traditions where we are not allowed to eat fish during particular times of the year. These times coincide with the spawning of the fish, and therefore this was a way of protection of these fish, animals and all of those things in our thing. So you see how we had the knowledge of agriculture, weather, rainfall predictions, astronomy, observational astronomy. They were all integrated, very well integrated into Shastras. So this is essentially the multidisciplinary, holistic approach that we had. Now thinking about the rigorous tradition of inquiry. So you're all familiar with formal reasoning that is there in Western scientific tradition. We talk about induction, deduction, logic computation, and we talk, of course, there is Gödel's incompleteness theorem, there is Fitch's knowability paradox, there is proof by contradiction that we do dimension analysis, similarity analysis, mathematical induction, we do thought experiments, of course, there is Occam's razor. These are all formal reasoning in the Western scientific tradition. Then what is it in the Indian tradition? We had the pramana concept. So we had talked about the prameya, which is the knowledge object of which the knowledge is being obtained, and then pramata, the one who is obtaining that knowledge, and the prama is that knowledge. Pramanam is the means of getting the knowledge and valid knowledge. And then when we talk about the logic systems, we had, of course, the binary logic systems in our country. Again, very famously, it's a Greek method of inquiry too. Aristotle, Raman, James Boole. In fact, modern computers are all based on the binary logic, as you know, the transistors and things like that. But we went beyond binary logic. We talked about Chatushkoti. For example, Acharya Nagarjuna talks about Chatushkoti. There was even eightfold logic that was there. And all of these things were developed in India for developing various forms. And when we talk about Pramanam, the way of obtaining the proper knowledge, there were 6 Pramanas. There is Pratyaksha, which is direct perception, Anumana, that is inference. And these, remember, even the modern science uses only these 2. The Pratyaksham and some part of Anumana, that's all. Whereas our basically Indian traditions went beyond that. So essentially the science was, the modern science is a subset of the pramanas that are used in the Indian traditions. They included the Shabda or Agama and Upamana, Arthapatti and Abhava or Anupalabdhi as they call it. The 6 pramanas, and each of these had very rigorous standards of what would be considered a valid pramana. So, for example, if I am saying pratyaksha pramana, valid pratyaksha pramana, then it had to be produced by the sannikarsha, that means the contact of the senses organs with that object. And then it should be something that is avyapadeshyam, that means it should not be expressible by words. Imagine eating a rasgulla. So, that rasgulla is contacting my tongue and I am feeling the delicious taste of that rasgulla. There is no way I can express the joy that I experience with that, eating that rasgulla. And that's because it's avyapadesham. I cannot express it by words. And then, of course, it also has to be avyabhichari. That means it should not be non-erroneous, non-deviation. My tongue is clean and things like that. So I'm actually able to perceive it correctly. And vyavasayatmaka, there should be crystal clear clarity on what it is. And again, it is produced by the contact with my tongue, which is the sense organ. So These are the characteristics of the Pratyaksha Pramana. And there were things like this that we had very rigorous standards for what would be acceptable as a Pramana. And once that was accepted as a Pramana, then there was other reasoning that went on. That is, entire discipline of the Nyaya Darshana is about this kind of things. And in fact, if you look at the kind of rigor, the Vaisheshika and Nyaya are the foundations of Sankhya and this thing for many of our disciplines. In fact, if you look into Charaka Samhita, which is an Ayurveda text, it talks about things like verify by observation and inference what is discussed in text. It says, Purvam Aptopadesha Jnanam. First of all, approach a good teacher who has no agenda, Aptaha, that means one who is Apta, and then obtain the Jnana. Then, Tataha, after that, Pratyakshanumanabhyam parikshopapadyate. After that, verify by observation and anumana or the inference. That is what Charaka Samhita says. And Charaka Samhita is a 2500-year-old text. And it also talks about cause and effect relationships. Not just simple cause and effect relationships in one time, but it talks about retrospective, prospective and concurrent relationships. This is so scientific in its approach that, I mean, in fact, Charaka Samhita says, clinical success not backed by evidence is to be dismissed as a chance effect. In fact, it says, Vinatarkena yasiddhir yadruchaya siddhirevasa. And this correlation is not causation type thing. Statement is something that you find in Charaka Samhita also. And imagine, this is a 2500-year-old text. This is the kind of rigor that we had in our disciplines. And it's also very important to have the proper context. And why is it important? Because these are all, more than 95% of the literature that is found in manuscripts is not pertaining to Vedas or Upanishads or Puranas. It is pertaining to all these Shastras, whether we are talking about Nyaya Shastra, Vaisheshika, or basically your aesthetics, Natya Shastra, whether we are talking about Ganita, Jyotisha, Dhatu Shastra, Rasayana Shastra, Krushi Shastra, Pashu Ayurveda, all of these things, Ayurveda and all of these things. So these are all technical texts. So you need to have the domain knowledge to understand and interpret these Shastras properly. And therefore, just to give you one example here, you see that sentence there, Bhakto guna shuddhyati yena tena labdhya cha gunyo gunitam phalam va. This, if you ask somebody who knows only Sanskrit, without giving any context, if I ask somebody to translate this, they will say, Bhakto gunaha shuddhyati yena tena labdhya. Bhakto means devotee, gunaha, devotee's qualities, shuddhyati will get purified, yena tena labdhya, therefore they will get the fruit of the devotion and things like that. So, but it's devotee purified with the devotion will get the fruit of devotion is a nonsensical translation for this thing. Why? Because this is not a text on some philosophy. This is a text called, part of the text called Lilavati, written by Bhaskaracharya in 12th century. This used to be the standard textbook for our kids, our children in India until the Macaulay education took over. And what here he is talking about is Bhaktaha means the divisor and Gunaha means multiplication, Labdhya you will get. So it is actually talking about in verse is about associative property, using the associative property of for multiplying large numbers essentially. And if you see other things, for example, this is again from a chapter called Gandhayukti from Brihat Samhita. Remember that Varaha Mihra's Brihat Samhita. So this is from that. And this is an encyclopedic work. So therefore there are many aspects that he talks about. He talks about rainfall prediction there. He also talks about making perfumes in it. So in one such shloka, he says, if I take 16 raw materials for making perfumes, and I'm taking a collection of 4 out of them, how many perfumes can you make? How many types of perfumes can you make by taking 4 materials out of 16 combinations, raw materials? So it turns out that it is about 1820. And how did they calculate that? Essentially, that is what is called normally as is a combinatorial problem. Taking 4 objects at a time out of a combination of out of a group of 16, how many combinations can you make? And they did not really, at that time, they did not have the formula. They had developed formula a few centuries later, but this is how they did it, in a very algorithmic way, in a computational way. Again, this is where the thinking process, the drishti of Bharatiya Ganita was computational in thinking, whereas the Greek was axiomatic in thinking. That again, you see such differences in practical applications. So in Bharati Ganita, you don't see pure and applied mathematics. You see everything is Ganita for us. Whereas in Greek, if you come from a Greek tradition, you'll see pure mathematics and applied mathematics. So you see here, so how do we calculate NCR? You see, you take 16 combinations, there are 16 materials, and then you go to the second column. You start from the bottom. So you start writing 1, then you add 1 plus 2, the next row from the previous column. So 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 3 is 6, 6 plus 4 is 10, 10 plus 5 is 15, and so on and so forth, and you go all the way up to 120. Then you go to the third column. Then you again start with 1, then take 1 plus 3 is 4, 4 plus 6 is 10, 10 plus 10 is 20, 20 plus 15 is 35, so on and so forth until you leave the top two rows. Then you go to the fourth column. You say again 1, 1 plus 4 is 5, 5 plus 10 is 15, so on and so forth. And you go up until you go to 1820. And if you see, 1820 is the number of possible combinations that you will get, number of perfumes you will get, unique perfumes you will get if you take 4 raw materials at a time, and then basically take them out of 16 types of raw materials, taking 4 at a time. And here we are not even discussing the complications that will arise if you take different amounts. That is another complication that is there. And these are all the kind of beautiful things where you are talking about making perfumes, but you are all simultaneously talking about mathematics this way. And this is a kind of interesting thing. And then and these are all not something that were only done earlier. Even as late as in 17th century, in Shankara Varma, Sadratnamala, he basically talks about a system called Katapayadi system. And what is that? Essentially he says, Nangavatincha Shunyani Sankhya Katapayadiyah Mishretu Pantyahala Sankhya Nacha Chintyo Halaswaraha. So just taking the letters of Sanskrit alphabets, Kakha Cha Cha Jhanga, Tatada Dhana Tatada Dhana, Papa Babhama, Yara La Sha Sha Saha La. And if you look at it, basically takes all the Vyanjanas and then gives them numbers, values of numbers, and then ignores the swaras. That means ka, ka, ki, ki, all of those things will mean just the value of ka. So similarly, ta, ta, ti, ti, all of those will mean whatever the value of ta is, that is 6 here. And similarly so forth. So you can actually code for various words. Words can have numbers associated with them. So for example, you see vacha. If I go and look at va in this column, in the fourth column, I see va in the last row, and that has a value of 4. And then the cha occurs in the first row and under number 6. So you see 6 there. So cha is associated with 6, va is associated with 4. And then in Bharati Ganita, we had a principle called Ankanam Vamato Gatihi. The numbers go from right to left, because we always start from the units place, tens place, hundreds place, thousands place, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the 4, when you say va, that is 4, that will go to the units place. Then we say cha, that is 6, it goes to the tens place. So vacha is becoming 64. Similarly, vachami will be 564, and so on and so forth. So this is a very clever way of encoding numbers in words. Now, where did they use this? For example, this is one example that many of you might want to remember. So I will, you see, this was used to encode the value of pi to so many digits, 14 digits. Bhadrambudhi siddhi siddhajanma ganita shraddhasma yad bhupagi. If you take it, basically if you use the principle of Ankanam Vamato Gati, you will get value of pi to 15 digits. And then there is another verse, very beautiful verse about Sri Krishna. Gopi bhagya madhuvrata shungesh chodhati sandiga khalajivita khatava galahala rasandhara. If you actually go, and here you don't have to use the Ankanam Vamato Gati principle. If you look at Gopi, Ga, that is 3, Pa is 1, Bha, that is Bha is 4, 3.14, and then you can get the entire value of pi up to 32 digits. And you see how beautifully they have encoded 32 digits of pi in a single shloka. This was the innovative approach. And in fact, Venkatamakhi in 17th century used this system to develop basically something, a coding system for Carnatic music in his book called Sangeeta Saramruta. He used what is known as basically the Kattapayadi system for encoding the Melakarta ragas. Melakarta ragas have all the 7 swaras in it. So Sari, Gama, Padani, they will have all the 7 swaras. And then there are 72 possible Melakarta ragas. So he has used this to come up with this kind of a Melakarta scheme, where you can just look at the name of the raga and you can use the Kattapayadi system for the first 2 letters. So let's say Kanakangi, Ka and Ka. Basically, Ka and Na becomes 0 and 1. 1 and 0. So it is the first raga. You should be able to get all the swaras, what kind of basically Melakarta raga it is, and then you should be able to just get the entire notations for all these Melakarta ragas by their names. And you see how beautifully they have, intelligently and in innovative way, they have encoded the system of the swaras. You don't have to memorize things. These are innovative approaches to remember things in a very beautiful way. And this is the innovative approach of pedagogy that we are talking about. You see how we have integrated in these examples of phonetics, Chanda Shastra, the music and the mathematics, all were integrated. And who is going to say that Gopi Bhagya Madhuvrata is not poetry? Who is going to say that it is not mathematics? Who is not going to say that it is an innovative pedagogy? This is essentially what we are talking about. And then similarly, the very famous story about the Jivakas, Korak, Korak, Korak. Who is healthy? Ko Aruk, who means who is disease free. Korak, Korak, who is healthy? Then he says the response is Hitabhuk, Mitabhuk, Rutubhuk. That means Hitabhuk is somebody who is what is good for the body. Mitabhuk eats in moderation. And Rutubhuk eats according to the seasons. And in just 6 words and a beautiful story of Jivaka, they have talked about the concept of integral health and well-being. This is the innovative approach of pedagogy. And all of this comes from the Jivana Darshana, the Jnana and the Vijnana, which are all informed by each other and basically translates into the Bharatiya Drishti. That makes this knowledge system Indian, which has been transmitted continuously for millennia through our Jnana Parampara, and which has prayojana, which has utility even in today's world and in the coming world. I hope in all of this previous discussion that we just had, you got an example of what is this Indian knowledge systems. What makes it relevant today? What makes it uniquely Indian? Why do we call this knowledge system as Indian? You saw that unique drishti, Bharatiya drishti, the parampara, jnana parampara that is continuously flowing, and then the laukika prayojana, the practical utility of this knowledge, informed by the jivana darshana, jnana and the vijnana that has arisen from this sacred land of Bharat for several millennia by the experience of all us Bharatiyas. And this essentially is what is Indian knowledge systems. And this is something that occurs in all Bharatiya Bhashas, all the languages of India, in all locations of India, in all areas of India, comes from all regions of India, and includes basically every aspect of human life that ever has been conceived. This is the broad perspective of the Indian knowledge systems that strives for the welfare of the world.